Welcome to the FVS Studio Art Podcast. In this podcast session, we will discuss linear and atmospheric perspective and how these two concepts can be used to add dimension to your work. You may be most familiar with linear perspective, which utilizes vanishing points, orthogonals, and horizon lines to demonstrate depth and objects moving forward and back in space. Similarly, atmospheric perspective uses a horizon line, but instead of using orthogonals and points to show perspective, it relies on size and level of detail to show distance and depth. Before we get started, please go to the show notes where you will find two links. Open each link at a separate tab in your internet browser so that you will be ready to follow along. If you are not at your computer right now, you will need to visit the show notes later for a better understanding of some of the visual effects that we will be discussing. Perspective is one of the most important concepts that you will need to know about in this class. Often, when a drawing or painting looks a little weird, it is because the perspective is off. In some cases, the angles may be oriented incorrectly, making the objects stick out or appear to be floating in space. Or there might not be enough detail in the foreground or front of the piece to push the objects back in space. Have you ever taken a road trip through Kansas or another flat state? Have you ever noticed how the white lines on either side of the highway converge with the yellow line in the middle when you look off into the distance? Did you see how the road eventually disappears altogether? How it vanishes? The point where the road disappears is called the vanishing point. The vanishing point lies on the horizon, which is at the far edge of what the eye can see. The effect you are seeing with the road is called linear perspective. Linear perspective is easy to remember because it uses lines, or orthogonals, to demonstrate the illusion that objects are going back in space. In the case of our road, the white and dotted yellow lines are the orthogonals. In landscapes and cityscapes, it is easy to see the orthogonal lines in fences, buildings, and power lines. All of these lines can be traced back to a vanishing point on the horizon line. Objects like cars or trees get smaller as they move up the orthogonal and closer to the horizon line. However, we do not have to be outside to see linear perspective. We can see linear perspective indoors as well. If you are listening to this podcast on your computer in your house or your dorm, look up. Is there a table or bookshelf in front of you? Maybe you are sitting on your bed. Notice how the edge of the table closest to you is larger than the side farther away. Now look at the sides of your table or bed and see how they angle towards each other as they move away from you. Remember, objects get smaller as they move closer to the horizon line. But wait, you may be asking where the horizon line is. There's a wall in the way. This is where you will need to look at the walls of your room and at the lines where they meet the ceiling and the floor. Those lines are your orthogonals. Now, imagine those lines are going through the wall and crisscrossing each other way off in the distance. You may want to use a pencil or piece of paper to help you complete the line. That is your horizon line, and it should be somewhere in between the ceiling or floor depending on how tall you are. If this is too difficult for you to imagine, then check out link number 1 for a diagram of what we have discussed. Cool, huh? Now what about atmospheric perspective? Linear was easy to figure out because it has the word line in it, and we use lines to create perspective in linear perspective. But atmospheric? Atmosphere? What does that mean? Let's go back to our road trip through Kansas. Think about the fields of wheat, the sky, the water towers. Think about how much sky there was to see, how much air there was between you and the horizon. All that air is atmosphere. Now, take a moment to remember how hazy the faraway hills were and how the water towers began to fade away the longer you drove away from them. That is the effect of atmospheric perspective. Okay, so maybe you have never been to Kansas. For those of you who haven't had the pleasure, go to link number 2. This site, arthints.com, gives great tips for recognizing atmospheric perspective, which can also be referred to as aerial perspective. The first tip shows how objects' color saturation fades as they move back in space. This means that the variation of color decreases, and objects far away start to blend together into one hue. In this example, the London skyline appears blue, while the trees and houses close by are green, red, and brown. The next 2 tips show that contrast decreases and brightness increases as distance increases. This happens because the eye is unable to differentiate individual objects, so it creates one big mass to look at. That one big mass catches more light and appears brighter than objects in the foreground. The edges of that mass will remain sharp even as details fade. Remember not to make your edges fuzzy, or else the perspective will start to look off. Scroll down to tip number 8. Like with everything, there's an exception to the rules of atmospheric perspective. Very strong lighting can diminish the effects of this type of perspective. In this example, the sun is shining directly onto the peak of the mountain, which powers through the air between the object and the viewer and minimizes the haziness we might expect to see. The rest of the mountain, however, that does not receive this light, still shows the effects of the atmosphere and appears to be driven back in space. By now you should be able to recognize the difference between linear and atmospheric perspective. Hopefully, you will have some tips for how to use these techniques in your own work. Good luck, and thank you for listening.